Welcome to Making the Case for Community Engagement for Equitable Access to Nature. I'm Cathy Jordan, Children and Nature Network's Director of Research. Children and Nature Network's mission, having some slide issues here. Children and Nature Network's mission is to lead a global movement to increase equitable access to nature so that children and natural places can thrive. Today's webinar is focused on making green spaces and nature-based programs truly responsive to the needs and preferences of the diverse populations they serve. Engaging community residents, adult and child alike, through deep and genuine participatory approaches is one key approach to create truly equitable access to nature. This is the fifth in a regular series of webinars called Making the Case, each one paired with a special themed issue of our Research Digest, our monthly emailed publication featuring brief findings from hot-off-the-press research or a set of thematically aligned studies, what we call a special issue. You can sign up for the digest at the URL on this slide, which is also provided at the top of the chat. The digest special issue on today's topic was emailed at the end of May to subscribers and is available on the C&NN website. The Research Digest and this webinar series are two legs of the three legs of the research stool at C&NN. The other and most foundational is the Research Library, which houses over 900 summaries of research articles written in accessible lay language. The links to the Research Library as well as the Research Digest are provided at the top of the chat box. Making the Case webinars explore an issue from both a research and a practice perspective, encouraging a dialogue between these two ways of knowing. The format we'll use today will hopefully facilitate this research and practice exchange. First, we'll hear from Louise Chawla, Professor Emerita at CU Boulder. Louise will set the context from her perspective as a community-engaged researcher who has used participatory practices and written about them as a scholar for many decades. We'll then hear two case studies. Sonia Shankaran of the city of Madison will discuss Madison's work to create equitable access to nature as part of the 18-city cohort participating in the Cities Connecting Children to Nature project, or CCCN. CCCN creates more equitable and abundant access to nature in cities through a collaboration between the National League of Cities, Institute for Youth Education and Families, and the Children and Nature Network by offering city government and community leaders support and guidance, as well as funds. Meg Kelly of the Healthy Schools Campaign and director of the Space to Grow program will discuss Chicago's Green Schools program, taking a deeper dive into their effective and successful community engagement process. Space to Grow is a public-private partnership that is transforming Chicago schoolyards into vibrant outdoor spaces that support health and wellness, outdoor learning, connection to nature, and also leveraging public investment in green stormwater infrastructure to help address urban flooding issues. Just a couple of instructions about use of the chat box. Given the number of participants on the call, we'll be using the chat to engage you. We have reserved time at the end for questions and answers. We'll choose as many of your questions as we can to pose to our panelists during the Q&A section. A lot of the value of these webinars is the information that attendees share with each other. Please feel free to comment and offer resources in the chat. If you want to direct a comment to a webinar attendee, such as responding to someone who has asked a question in the chat, please start your response with that person's name. You can also direct a question to one of the presenters in the same way. Within a few weeks, we'll send you a resource page that'll provide written answers to as many questions posed in the chat as we can. That way, even if a question can't be answered during our time today, you'll receive a written response in July. Finally, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be sent to you later for you to view or to send to colleagues. Please note that all attendees are on mute throughout the webinar to ensure we don't have background noise. Again, please use the chat to ask questions or make comments. Now I'd like to turn it over to Louise Chawla to present our first section of our webinar.
Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone.
Sorry, Louise, this is Monica really quick. We have a couple people with audio. If you have access to the online chat, if you could enter in if you're having audio difficulty and we can tend to it. Thank you. Apologies for the interruption.
Okay, good. Okay, well, Welcome. As Cathy said, I come to this field of work from my background of practical experience doing this work for many years, for decades now, as Cathy said, but also from my background in developmental psychology and child development. And when we look at this work from these two perspectives, we see two major benefits for involving children and teens in planning, creating, and maintaining nature places in their cities, towns, and schools. One are the benefits for children and their communities, and then the other are the benefits for city agencies and professionals in design and urban planning who want to engage with young people and their communities in responsive ways, as Cathy said. Cathy, can you move me? Next slide. Okay. You can find there's really a large literature on this work. You can it's in the May Digest that Cathy mentioned. It's also in a book that came out late last year that I co-authored with two colleagues. In addition to a lot of practical guidance in this book on how to start initiatives, maintain them, ethics of participation, and step-by-step directions for many participatory methods. You'll find many references in this book to the research in this field that documents these benefits. And in addition to the May Digest that Cathy mentioned that has really good resources on these different topics, there's also a resource list that will be available for you later, and Cathy mentioned that, and there'll also be additional lists of resources for you to really dig into this, both practical guidance on how to do it as well as research that documents the benefits. I want to say that most of this research consists of case studies because every community is unique, and yet at the same time, it can draw lessons learned that can help other people who are seeking to initiate and troubleshoot their own work in this field. Next, Cathy. Okay. So benefits for children, teens, and their communities. It's a way to learn for civic development, to learn how local decision making on the level of cities, towns, and schools, how it works, and how to be part of it, how to play a collaborative role. These are always intergenerational processes because it takes partnerships among young people and adults to change places. It is work that has to be done by all ages together. And it's a hands-on direct way to learn democracy. There's an African proverb that I like that says that the child carried on the back doesn't know the length of the road. And that's really true in democracy. It's not that all of a sudden young people reach voting age and they know how government processes work, how to be part of it, believe that they can be part of it, and they need opportunities to experience it as they're growing up. Next. It's also a way to learn about ecosystems and how to design with nature. When the focus is creating nature places, it becomes a form of place-based education. And all of the images that I'm showing you here come from different projects we've engaged with our Growing Up Boulder program here in Boulder, the city of Boulder in Colorado. And the first step in approaching design or planning in any area is, what does this area contain? How does this ecosystem work? Is it in a floodplain or not? And what does that mean for design and planning? And those kinds of questions. Young people need to start out with this basic research on where they are and what can be done then, and what kind of plants grow here, what kind of wildlife. So all of this becomes an added benefit of hands-on learning about the environment. And for it creates better places for young people. And again, all different generations share places, so we very often work intergenerationally and bring often older people and young people together, because they actually share many of the same issues in terms of a good place that works for them. They tend to be more localized, have less free-ranging mobility, more likely to be walking in their communities, and really need a high-quality community right there where they are. And it's also a way for communities to see what young people can do. Many adults don't know that, don't know the levels of creativity and energy and really good, well-considered ideas that young people can bring to redeveloping and to improving their communities. Next, okay. In terms of city agencies and professions of urban design and planning, these participatory processes enable practitioners to create designs and plans that really serve people's authentic needs. These images right here, for example, show redevelopment along the civic area park and Boulder Creek that runs right through it in our city. This nature play space that you see, if you had been through the design process that involved more than 200 young people over a few years, you could just go through this picture and pick out, oh, I see young people's ideas here and here and there. And also along the creek itself, where young people wanted more access to really get down to the creek and create these kind of safe bays for play. So it's definitely a better park because of young people's participation in it. Next. Yeah. And it's a way for people in city government and urban planning and design professionals to reach communities that they typically cannot easily reach. We are dedicated to making at least half of our projects focused on working with young people from family backgrounds that are typically not engaged in local civic processes. And it's a way, in this image, you have some children in an English immersion class. So they're in the process of learning English while they're in elementary school. And that's a staff person who's a community outreach liaison from the Department of Parks and Recreation. And so it brings people from cities and from professional firms into the places where children are to engage with them and hear from communities they typically don't hear from. Next. So we have a saying in the field that a city that is good for children is good for all ages. In my experience over many, many years, I find that children, when they're asked to do this and really engage in this authentic work, they don't just think about themselves and what they want. They just naturally think about different people in their communities. And of course, we can also create processes that bring people of different kinds together from their communities. So there are real dialogues created here. There are many networks now, and you'll see some of these in the resource list that you'll eventually get, that are bringing people together who are working this way. And the roots of this work go back to the 1960s and 1970s, and when there was a lot of ferment in our society and many democratic initiatives to be more inclusive. But what really kicked off work of this kind was in 1989, when the United Nations ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it includes Article 12 and other what we call the civic rights, other articles which state that children have a right to express their views freely in matters that affect them. Next. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it rules on how should the convention be implemented. It's ruled that includes that children have a right to a voice in decisions that affect their environment. So the United States is the only nation in the United Nations which has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's only one of many, many international conventions and agreements that the US is currently staying out of. But that does not stop cities, town governments, schools from independently endorsing children's rights, including their right to participation in environmental decision making. The United States has its own office for UNICEF, the United Nations Children Fund, which promotes the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the UN, back in 1996, started a program called the Child Friendly Cities Initiative, saying, okay, so if children have these rights in the places where they live, what does that mean? How do we implement them as practices at every level of civic governance? And has guidelines for that and many resources for that. You can find them on this website, and it will also be in your list of resources. Um, and recently, UNICEF has decided to really infuse a lot of time and investment in the Child Friendly Cities program. And with that, the United States Office of UNICEF has made this a current priority for this country, for the United States, including young people's participation in planning and designing their cities and towns. There was a recent gathering in May in Jacksonville, bringing people from cities together involved in this initiative, and there will be a follow-up in next year in the city of New York, and a keynote, because it will be made by one of my colleagues in the Growing Up Boulder program, and that's why I know this. They will have a keynote on children's participation in city design. So there's really a lot of spirit and energy behind this kind of work right now. I need to go back. I need to go back one more.
That's it. Sorry, Louise.
So in closing, I want to encourage you to think about not just involving children and teens in the initial stages of helping to come up with a concept design for a schoolyard or a place in their city or town, but also think about how you can involve them in a sustained way during design reviews, construction, maintenance, and cumulative improvements. And again, you'll find just suggestions for that in the resource material. In the resource list that you'll get, there's an article called Fluid or Fixed that I wrote with a couple colleagues, which includes a recent research review on specifically that point. But one of the things that really impressed me in working with my co-presenters in this webinar is that you'll see some really inspiring examples of this in their case studies, and I turn it over to them.
Great, thank you so much, Louise. I'd like to now turn it over to Sonia Shankaran from the City of Madison, who's going to talk a little bit about the City of Madison's work as part of the Cities Connecting Children to Nature.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sonia Shankaran. I am going to be talking a little bit about the work that we started with Cities Connecting Children to Nature nearly 3 years ago, and how we are kind of continuing to take that forward now. The way that we began was with some funding from the Children in Nature Network to kind of design an initiative that would help us on a citywide kind of scale engage those that are typically less engaged in the process of planning on a city level. So like Louise was saying, there are unfortunately these, the typical groups in our community that are not at the table for decision making are lower income community members, as well as a lot of our communities of color are not typically engaged in city planning. And this initiative was really inspired by the public health department, who originally went for this funding, because of these kind of great disparities between those groups who are less engaged in these processes and those who end up being at the table, who are obviously usually are kind of middle class white community members. So they were looking at health disparities, particularly among children, and looking at how planning and engagement could mitigate for some of these kinds of disparities. So in our initial design process, we used several community engagement kind of strategies. And one was that we wanted to look at service providers, people who are typically engaging with these communities, less served communities, and say, okay, well, what is your experience? How are kids and families getting outside? And why would they not be getting outside? And how can we use that to design this initiative to better suit their needs? So we went out into neighborhood centers and a variety of places and interviewed folks to kind of understand what those barriers were and how do they enjoy being outside, instead of kind of imposing a model for how we thought people should be outside. And then we had also this lovely opportunity of having about, I think it was 6 interns that summer. They were teen interns employed by the city, and they worked with us, and their job was to actually go and interview youth at those centers to understand with the youth perspective, why do you get outside? Why do you like being outside? And what prevents you from being outside? And a lot of those children, their answers were, my mom says it's not safe. It's too hot, the park is too far from my home, different things. So we gathered all that data as well. And then as a small kind of side project, just to kind of teach these interns and also get their input on placemaking, we had them design a small nature park at the center that we were working. So this picture is actually of one of our interns, and they designed a triangular sandbox because they wanted it to be triangular, because most sandboxes are square. And those logs are actually from our city forestry department. So there was engagement on a bunch of different levels in kind of this small placemaking piece there. Can you advance my slide, please, Cathy? Thank you. So then the following year, what we did was we worked with, we used the data from that first year to design an initiative, which was to address nature play and learning at the preschool level. So we started to understand that, a lot of these health disparities you start to see health disparities occurring from the age, kind of this age 0 to 3 range. And so we thought we'd get into preschools that are serving our lower income communities and work with those who seem to be already kind of engaging with processes that would bring nature play and learning into the schools. So they are people that had already worked with the city licensing department on bringing nature into the school. And we wanted to support those schools that had showed an interest. So we went into 7 preschools. And again, we did some extensive interviewing. We interviewed preschool staff. We interviewed parents and kids to kind of understand, well, what would really be the most appropriate way to bring nature play and learning into your center. And we were trying to look at these different kind of areas. One was actual kind of infrastructure in their outdoor space. One would be their curriculum. One was their policies, and then finally professional development, kind of ongoing staff development and learning. And then the other piece of that project was our Children in Nature teens. Again, we had teen interns. They actually took those plans and the pieces that we identified were needs from the preschools, and they constructed those preschool play area components. And we were lucky enough to work with the Madison Parks construction crew and our arborists and our rangers, and actually get into their shop, this big, beautiful shop. And our teenagers did a bunch of capacity building in that shop, learning how to build that summer. They also designed this beautiful mural that you can see in the slide as we started to talk more about kind of your power, your community's power to change your space and change your outlook. And that mural reads, "You have the power, you have the power to make a difference." So all of these placemaking pieces kind of allowed for a lot of really rich discussion with these teens and also with the Madison Parks Department. And we learned a lot, which I'll cover later. Can you advance my slide, please? Thank you. So as far as our continued work right now, we are creating what we're calling a nature nook in kind of nested within a larger park to try to push this envelope of, okay, how can we, I guess, adapt the city's typical planning process to encompass community voices more. A lot of times our city planners are not necessarily, our planners, our landscape architects are not necessarily naturally inclined to kind of work with communities in the way that we're talking about. And they don't necessarily have the training, or that might not be their natural, their way of planning. And so this is kind of a way to document, well, how does that look? And so that's why they brought me on as a community engagement specialist. So we're working with a community center that is near this park. We're engaging community center elders, which we are kind of just interviewing on what's their value of nature. This might be in their kind of native country or currently, and then also actual design ideas. And in the pictures below, these are we have a lot of Hmong elders in that community, and they mentioned, because this park is near a lake, they mentioned the water spirit of the dragon. And so there's this bracelet that a lot of people in that community wear with dragon heads. And so we're thinking about building a wall with dragon heads on it, for example. They talked about the value or the importance of having a hut on where they garden. And that's a very important thing when they are outdoors, that they are kind of feel comfortable having. So and the kids also mentioned having a fort. So we're thinking about making some kind of hut or fort that is culturally appropriate. So we also interviewed community center youth, had them participate in activities where we can have these kind of rich discussions, again, about their value of nature and design. They want a maze. So that's that picture of the log maze down below. So they get really creative, and I feel like that ends up, they're a lot more creative than our typical landscape architects. And then the Madison Park staff, we're also working with them within their current policies and procedures to kind of find out how these creative park design elements can fit within their framework. And then we'll be running a community installation, several events in the fall, during which our participants can come, and we'll kind of create art pieces that will eventually be installed, and also maybe do some digging for stump to put stump steps in, or build small hills or things like that. Next slide, please. So our outcomes that we have seen over time, over the last almost 4 years now, we've seen youth empowerment. We definitely have observed these teens from beginning to end of these processes, just starting out with, they have a perception, they know that their community isn't typically engaged. They feel it, they know it, they see it, they feel followed in stores. They don't feel like they can, they always experience their experience in public spaces. They feel defensive. And by the end of this process, they are speaking differently. They're kind of coming up with solutions differently about who they can speak to and how they can advocate for themselves. And they're seeing spaces as malleable. They're seeing spaces as, oh, I could change that. I could do this, we see this kind of innovative engagement where we're able to engage in these different ways, whether it's mural painting or landscape design or whatever. These are different ways of engaging with communities that I think that they're more natural. And then this authentic placemaking, obviously these spaces are much more authentically reflective of the communities that use them. And I think I just have one more slide. Please, next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, we spent a lot of time building relationships. I feel like this is something that is not typically budgeted for. Really deep and long-term relationship building is paramount to the success of these projects. There just aren't shortcuts, especially with youth, because you need to build trust, and and it's not just for today or tomorrow, but it's when those kids come back in 3 or 4 years and they're decision makers, and hopefully they're also looking for employment to do these kinds of things for the city. Listening and informing go hand in hand. I feel like, we did a lot of extensive community interviews, and with that context, we provided participants information on the importance of time in nature. But we also we listened to their experiences, and we highlighted how that experience was important because of what it revealed about mental and physical health benefits and consequences in their community. And then city policies, and these procedures, they're going to take time to influence. There has to be buy-in, but staff needs to understand benefits of these spaces being creative. And we also need to understand what their obstacles are, because it's not easy to fit what we're talking about within their usual process. And lastly, like Louise was saying, our adults need inspiration too, and our city often wants to be responsive, and there are a lot of people that are looking for ways. We just need to be more creative. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass it back on.
Thanks so much. While Meg is pulling up her set of slides, Sonia, I want to direct one question to you that's come in through the chat. This question about whether Madison has compared the constraints data to national level barriers research. Nina says, decades of research out there. How is what you've learned in Madison similar or different from what we already know? Can you give a quick response to that before we move on to Meg?
Sure. I'm sorry, you meant obstacles like within our city kind of policies and procedures. Is that what you're gathering from that question?
Has Madison compared the constraints data gathered from local community with national level barriers research?
National level barriers research. We have had the privilege of communicating a lot with our cohort. So there were 6 other cities besides Madison that received this original funding, and we get to kind of share with them a lot. And I haven't looked at research currently, but I know from these other folks that we talk to that it is very common, and it's that these obstacles exist. And that's exactly why we're having this webinar and why this is innovative, right? To kind of get into communities in these creative ways and design spaces together, is because it's a common obstacle.
Can I jump in for 1 minute?
Sure, Louise.
Yeah. And in the field of public health, certainly the public health disparities between more privileged neighborhoods and privileged groups and the communities you were like those that you were working with, Sonia. There's a lot of research that documents both disparities in terms of what is physically available for communities like nature, and health disparities.
Yeah, the health data is absolutely there, and that's why the health department was able to get this funding and kind of was a unique participant in the cohort. San Francisco was another city that was looking at this work from a public health perspective specifically. So yeah, that data is absolutely there.
Okay, I'm going to take us now to Meg. Thank you so much, Sonia. Meg, take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm so excited to be part of this presentation today. I'm just going to let everyone know that I have been nurturing a summer cold, and so I'm hoping my voice participates with me for the whole time. So I apologize in advance if I get any coughing in between here in the end. Anyway, I am the Space to Grow director from Healthy Schools campaign here in Chicago. Space to Grow is a partnership that uses a unique funding model to implement our program. And I'm going to just talk a little bit today about sort of who's at the table and why, just to set that up very briefly, and then kind of get into our community engagement and input processes. Because it is sort of the cornerstone of our program, and why we feel it's been, and we feel why it's been so successful. So Space to Grow is Chicago's Green Schoolyards program, and we're working together in this partnership to transform spaces at schools to support a culture of wellness, outdoor learning, engagement with nature, and create beautiful public spaces that also are managing some of our stormwater issues that lead to basement flooding, which is a big problem here in Chicago. And these are public spaces after school and on the weekends. And so, making sure that community is engaged early is really important to the long-term sort of success in activating these spaces. So we've been very intentional from the beginning of our program about making sure that piece is incorporated, acknowledged as important and successful. So just a little bit of context about our school district here in Chicago. We have over 360,000 students, almost 90% of whom are students of color, almost 77% of whom are from low-income families. We employ over 20,000 teachers, and our school district is one of the largest public landowners of impermeable surfaces here in Chicago, and that's important for the way our funding partnership is structured. So Healthy Schools Campaign and Openlands are two Chicago-based nonprofits, and we serve as the managing partners for the program. We also provide the community engagement piece, as well as additional support to all of the schools where we work. So that includes professional development for every teacher, hands-on engagement and learning opportunities for every student at each school that we work with, technical assistance for schools around gardening and wellness teams and parent education, engagement, and empowerment. And we're also doing things like community events and other education opportunities, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Together, our two organizations fundraise from the philanthropic and corporate communities to support the mission-based work that we're doing at these schools. And then the capital costs, the construction for the schools themselves, are coming from three public agencies here in the city. So obviously Chicago Public Schools, where we're doing these transformations, as well as our Department of Water Management and our Water Reclamation District. So those are the two agencies in our city who are responsible for treating our wastewater and delivering clean water back to the residents. And those two water agencies have made a significant commitment to investing in green stormwater infrastructure to help with our flooding issues. And what that means is, with CPS being such a large landowner of public space that is impermeable, so things like asphalt, concrete, what have you, it's a real good opportunity to change the way those spaces are managed and create these public sort of parks, essentially, that are also outdoor classrooms and provide a host of benefits, not just for the school, but for the community. So again, Healthy Schools Campaign, we are a nonprofit based here in Chicago, and we operate on the common sense notion that healthy students are better learners and health and wellness should be incorporated into every aspect of the school experience. So when we were successful a few years ago in recess being reinstated as mandatory after not being sort of available for about 30 years. And we also have a daily PE policy here. And when all that happened, our partners on the ground, alerted us that the facilities that they have, especially outdoors, weren't necessarily the best for supporting vibrant outdoor programming. And so for us, Space to Grow was, a really natural segue for making sure kids can be active at school and having access to spaces to grow food and connect that to nutrition education. And our partner Openlands is our regional conservation organization and land trust here in the city. And they're, sort of focused on connecting people to nature in their daily lives, right where they live. And there's a number of programs that they offer, as well as advocacy and policy work. But sort of what better place to do that than at schools, where children come every day and their parents come, and here in Chicago are in the center of neighborhoods, so there's always neighbors nearby as well. So just a really, multiple benefit way of reaching a number of people by transforming these spaces into green spaces. And again, we're just trying to make sure that there's opportunity for kids to be active, for spaces to grow food, to connect with the native plants that we're growing in the rain gardens, and just places to gather so that parents can come and watch their kids, or neighbors and community can have a space in nature to gather outdoors as well. And again, everything is designed to hold all that water back and protect people's homes. So a couple before-after pictures to give an idea of the scale. As you can see, there's traditional play equipment, sports and tracks, a number of gardens. Like I said, all of our gardens are using native vegetation to the area. We're using rain gardens. Sort of a number of different elements and applications. But hopefully what you'll notice is that none of these really looks the same, right? And one of the reasons is because we're so intentional about making sure that everybody has the opportunity to input into what goes into this space. I'm going to echo what Sonia mentioned sort of as one of her last statements, which is it's a process and it's a relationship building sort of program. It's not just here's a few meetings, we're going to collect some data and information, but our community sort of planning and design process of the schoolyard is the first step in like a long-term, long game relationship building program that really helps to make sure that these spaces and that the schools feel supported in keeping these spaces active and well used and well maintained, because this is sort of a different way that most of our schools are operating with their communities. So opening this up, inviting people in is a little bit different than how they'd been operating before being part of the program. That's not true for all of our schools, but certainly for many of them. So the planning process, for those of you who have a brain that works like mine, I like to see everything in a chart form. So here's a little bit of a visual of what we do. From the first sort of orientation and like committee planning meeting to schoolyard construction completion, it's about a year, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But we do the first sort of 3 months is that sort of ramping up, bringing everybody in and understanding priorities, concerns, their values for the outdoor space, and showing them concept plans that they can weigh in on, and just doing a few listening sessions and moving towards consensus on a final design. It's a critical. It is intensive, but it's critical to making sure that we learn who the champions are. We learn who's in the community and who wants to use the space and who's going to help sort of help support the school, keep it active and maintained. We also celebrate when it opens, right? So after the construction process happens, there's always opportunities for people to come and experience the place together. We also do planting days or stewardship days. We do events and workshops as well along the way. So have a whole sort of program kind of outlined to support that. I just have a couple of minutes left and a couple of things that I wanted to point out as part of our input process. It is iterative. We're coming back and meeting multiple times. We are providing multiple opportunities for the input. So understanding that everybody's comfort level for providing input is going to be a little bit different. So we're providing visual, written, like verbal, written opportunities. So photo surveys, writing things in your own words, one-on-one conversations, mapping exercises that really help spark communication and spark information and start to build those deep relationships early so that we can continue to build on those over the years. The process is also structured that way. It's like an open house station style, like activity station style process, because it also helps us be aware of and understand power dynamics within the room. So it really does give everybody an opportunity for their voice to be heard. I'm going to once again echo Sonia's sentiment that this is a long game, right? So that input process is our first step in a longer term program. It helps us identify the champions. It helps us support them in reaching out to their networks, right? So we will, so just to go through my lessons from the field one by one, communicating consistently. This is a construction project at some point. Things are likely to get delayed. Funding can often, become a little bit, jeopardized or what, like sometimes these things come up, right? So we have to be able to, as part of that maintaining trust process, the communication and being transparent about it is key. So even if it's bad information, it's necessary to kind of keep everybody in the loop at all times, right? And of course, communicate the good. But one of the things that we do at the beginning of the process is identify a planning team, a committee of parents, students, teachers and staff, neighbors and community members, even if they don't have kids at the school. And we form this committee to become liaisons to their networks. And then we provide them with communications samples so that they can pluck language from an email template or newsletter template or social media post, whatever it is. We just try to make it as easy for them as possible because schools are very complex, busy places with lots going on. And so we want to make sure that we're supporting them in this process as well. And then, as always, make sure you're engaging the trusted messengers. Many times when I go to a school and do that first meeting, this is the first time I've ever been at this school. I know I am not the trusted messenger within their community because nobody knows me. So that's why that committee and working with working with the school to identify those trusted messengers is really important, because you want to make sure people do actually feel welcome and kind of show up to the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cathy, but I do want to thank you for your time. I know it's super high level, so I'm happy to talk about any more details. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Meg. Yes, thank you. I had to get myself off of mute. Thanks so much, Meg. While some questions are starting to come in the chat for you, Meg, I'm going to actually turn to a question or two to Louise. We have about 8 minutes for questions. So Louise, quickly, have you had any resistance from professionals, planners, decision makers to this participation process? And if so, how have you ensured the children's participation is meaningful and not tokenistic?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I want to go back then immediately to what both Sonia and Meg said, that about the importance of building relationships. My colleague Willem Van Vliet has a saying that relationships come before resources. And so it's not that you'll get a big pot of money and, oh, great, now we run out and we do this. You really got to start from the ground up. And so when you're talking to, say, the facilities department and in the school district administration office, you're not speaking alone. You're going there with people who represent other advocacy or organizations for young people in your city. You're going there with members of the communities that are involved, and there's really a power in relationships. But nothing speaks better than a good example. And I mean, we've seen, because we've been involved in the Growing Up Boulder program for more than 10 years now, it is a process of building trust, of building relationships. And as things work out, of course, there will be setbacks, as Meg was saying, and you need to sit down and work through those. But as things move forward and, the professionals that you're working with in city agencies or contracted firms see that, oh, I got some new ideas, things I never thought about. I see the excitement of the community in this process, and I'm seeing a product that we can all be proud about. That's really how you convince people and bring them on board.
Thank you. So, Meg, I have a question for you. This is from Nina Roberts. I see two universities on evaluation specs, Loyola and UC. Can you talk a little bit about what their role is?
Yes. Sorry, I think I skipped right over that when I was introducing who's at the table and why. So, as part of the program, we, and especially, Healthy Schools Campaign and Openlands are supported by the philanthropic and corporate community. And so, we have committed to evaluating our progress and our work over time, and have found it very useful to learn a lot about ourselves along the way, because then we're able to adapt. So the U.S. Geological Survey is one
Meg,
of the Yep.
Nope, go ahead. You're about to answer the actual question, which
Yes.
was what is the USGS role? Thank you.
Yep. So they are working with us to help. So they're working with us to help monitor the stormwater piece and do our just understanding how the green infrastructure is working. So far, they tell us it's working very well. So that's great. And then Loyola University Chicago and the Nutrition Policy Institute from University of California have been working with us to evaluate the impact on schools, students, and communities, and specifically around that health piece and community cohesion. They also tell us we're working pretty well. So that's great. We're glad to hear it.
Great. And one more question from you, Meg, and then I'll go back and ask another one of Louise. I think Sonia has been answering her questions in the chat for anybody who's looking for information about Sonia's talks. But Meg, another question was, are loose natural materials or loose parts part of any spaces you've created? In the community engaged planning process during brainstorming session, is this an option, or has this idea ever been brought forth by staff or the community members?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to the last part of that question, has it ever been brought forth as an option or like a desire, is yes. Is it really an option? Not completely yet. So this program has been working with the Chicago Public Schools sort of within their current specifications for construction of elementary schools, which are a little bit different than making natural play spaces. So we've been just working to break down some of those barriers and try new things along the way. So it's I would say we would call this a work in progress, the loose natural materials. But nature play is something that we are showing people and asking them if it would be a priority. So the more of the more support we have from parents, community members, and students for that, the easier it's going to be to help us break down those barriers with specifications and being allowed to test out new things with the school district.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question of Louise, and then I think we will probably wrap it up. Please know that all of these questions in the chat will be part of a resource sheet that you will get in a few weeks, and all the presenters will answer your questions in writing. So even if your question in the chat didn't get asked here verbally, you will get a written response. So Louise, last question.
Cathy, before you ask that question, I just want to jump into that last part that Meg was talking about.
Sure.
In late May, I was able to go around to some Trust for Public Land schoolyard greening projects in Brooklyn, in New York, and practical challenges are, I'm sure it's similar in Chicago, Meg. You may have like over 1,000 kids running out and using that playground, every day. And so the natural areas, and I think you could see some of that there in the pictures that Meg showed, they need to be in protected spaces like bays or edges, but also the Trust for Public Land is working with a nonprofit that brings pop-up loose parts. So loose parts experiences that way that they're brought into these spaces. So that's one way of meeting these challenges. All right, go ahead, Cathy.
Okay. Only 2 minutes left, so a quick response, Louise. You mentioned how a diversity of children and people can be involved in design processes. Where obstacles to participation are present for certain people, what useful steps have you taken to increase equity in being able to participate?
Okay. I think rule number one for that is we go where children are. We tried in the very beginning, scheduling meetings at the university with all kinds of enticements, and that was a lesson learned for us. And we learned to partner again with trusted people that children and teens are already working with in an after-school program or at their housing development community center in their schools with their teachers. We go where young people are. We have a disabilities group with young people in our city, and we work with them. And then it becomes also a process of capacity building for staff in these places and teachers. And how do you make this kind of participatory work, something you can do, and then we can match you with people from the city who have spaces where they need your input, that really help train people to take these processes and run with them.
All right. Well, thanks so much to our presenters, Louise Chawla, Sonia Shankaran, Meg Kelly, to all of you for your great questions and your interest in engaging communities to create equitable access to nature. This webinar has been recorded and will be available via follow-up email, along with that resource sheet that I talked about earlier, in which we'll document our responses to as many of your questions in the chat as we can. Please feel free to share that recording and these resources with your colleagues who couldn't be with us today. Just a little disclaimer, through your registration and participation in this free webinar, you are also subscribing to C&NN Communications. You may opt to unsubscribe from these communications at any time. Thank you again for your participation and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.